Don't let them see you shaking." The girl's voice was steady. Her fingers were not. Dirt caked her palms, her knees, her lips cracked from thirst. The other women around her, former nurses, clerks, and radio operators, stood frozen at the edge of the compound, staring at the men on horseback approaching through the dust. They had been told the Americans were monsters, but no one had said anything about cowboys, hats tilted low, dust rising, spurs clinking with each step. They looked like something out of a nightmare or a dream too strange to be believed. One dismounted, tall and silent, and took off his hat. The others followed, and then he offered her a folded blanket, wool, clean, with a pattern of red and blue stars. She didn't move, couldn't. The blanket touched her hands. "You cold?" he asked, his accent thick and strange. She swallowed. Not because she was cold, but because she had never, not once, been asked if she was. Not by an enemy, not by anyone. The sky above them stretched wide, impossibly wide, a shade of blue so harsh it looked painted, not real. They stepped off the transport trucks one by one, boots worn through at the soles, uniforms sagging off bodies that hadn't known proper nourishment in months. The desert heat hit like a fist, dry, unrelenting, clinging to the skin like invisible ash. It was nothing like the damp jungles of the Pacific or the overgrown Philippine forests. This was an entirely different battlefield. There was no shade, no jungle canopy, just the sun and the wind and the dust that stuck to their sweat like accusation. The camp rose out of the dust like a mirage. Barbed wire fences, yes, but behind them. Wooden buildings, clean paths, a mess hall with smoke curling from a chimney. And beyond it all, horses. Real horses, brown and black and dappled, tied near hitching posts or trotting in wide circles. The women froze at the sight, unsure if they were hallucinating. Horses meant freedom. Horses meant escape. But these were not for them. These belonged to the guards, and the guards, God, the guards. They were not the barking, boot-stomping, club-wielding monsters they had imagined. No helmets, no polished medals, no rigid columns of uniformity. These men wore broad-brimmed hats, their shirts rolled at the sleeves, their faces dark with sun and dust, not anger. Their boots thudded against the dirt with a slow, deliberate rhythm, the kind that said they were in no rush to prove anything. Their rifles were slung low, almost casually, like afterthoughts. They did not shout orders. They gestured, nodded, observed. One woman muttered to another in Japanese, "Are they cowboys?" The word sounded strange in her mouth. Cowboys were stories, myths, characters in forbidden American films shown in hushed rooms before the war, stories of dusty justice and barroom standoffs, not real men who offered blankets. But here they were. The gate opened with a metallic squeal, and they were led inside. The women walked stiffly, each step echoing with dread. They expected humiliation at any moment, stripping, jeering, cold water. But what greeted them first was a smell, meaty, rich, spiced. Stew, real stew, not the salted slivers they had scraped from tin cans. This was thick and steaming, carried by a young soldier with a ladle in hand. He wore denim pants, a leather belt, and a red handkerchief around his neck. He looked like a cartoon, but the food was real. A harmonica played softly in the distance. It was all wrong. The prisoners were shown to their barracks, rows of wooden structures lined with beds that had sheets, not blankets thrown on dirt floors, actual sheets, pillows. One woman ran her fingers across the fabric and recoiled as if burned. The sensation of softness was foreign, dangerous. It felt like a trap. Outside, the sun began to set, and the sky lit up in streaks of orange and purple. The light painted long shadows of the cowboys tending to the horses, feeding them oats, brushing their coats. One of them lit a cigarette and looked toward the barracks. He didn't leer, he didn't smile, he just tipped his hat, a slow, courteous motion that sent a ripple of unease through the women watching from behind the screen door. Inside the mess hall, the air was thick with food and smoke and something else, calm. Trays were set out, bread, beans, meat, a jug of cold water. The women hesitated. Aki, one of the older nurses, stared down at the tray and whispered, "Poisoned. It must be." But when a guard took a bite of the same food and said nothing, just chewed with bored disinterest, she sat down. None of this made sense. The American flag fluttered on a pole outside, crisp and bright against the desert wind. It did not feel like surrender. It felt like something worse, like being forgotten by war itself. That night, some women cried into their pillows, confused by the quiet, the warmth, the strange civility. Others lay wide-eyed, waiting for the cruelty that had been promised to begin. But it didn't come. Just the sound of crickets, of boots pacing, of someone, probably a guard, playing the harmonica again. The war they had left behind was gone. What waited here was something stranger, not freedom, not captivity as they had known it, something in between, something wrapped in denim and leather, moving slow beneath the stars. And for now, that was the most terrifying thing of all. The next morning, the sun rose fast and brutal, drying the dew before it could settle. A bell clanged somewhere outside, not harsh, not angry, just a single echoing note that signaled the start of something. The women stirred slowly, unsure if they were supposed to move or wait for barking commands. But no one barked. No one kicked in the doors. A cowboy in a wide-brimmed hat simply appeared at the threshold, nodded once, and walked away. The message was clear. Follow if you're ready. They dressed in silence. The barracks smelled faintly of wood smoke and something else, fresh linen. That too was disorienting. No mold, no stench, no shame. Just beds that didn't hurt your back and sheets that had clearly been washed. When they stepped outside, the air was already warm, and the sky so big it felt like they might fall into it. A few guards stood near the mess hall, rifles slung low, their faces unreadable beneath the shadows of their hats. Not one raised his voice. The absence of aggression was unsettling. Back home, silence meant danger. Officers yelled when they cared. Beatings came fast when discipline mattered. But here the quiet stretched long and strange. Orders, when given, came in gestures, a point, a nod, a wave of the hand. And yet somehow everyone understood what to do. It wasn't laxity, it was something else. Control that didn't need to be proven. As they filed into the mess hall, one guard opened the door and held it without speaking. Aki walked through stiffly, not meeting his eyes. The moment passed without incident, and yet it lingered. A door opened without force. A courtesy offered without condescension. She didn't say thank you. She didn't know how. Not in this context, not when the person showing respect was supposed to be your enemy. The coffee was already poured when they sat down. A jug of milk, real milk, stood at the end of the table. Someone had placed a tin of sugar cubes beside it. Nothing was said about it, no speech, no gesture, just the quiet presence of things that should not have been there. Clean water, hot coffee, buttered toast. A ritual of normalcy inside a world that had been anything but. Later that day, the women were shown around the camp. It was not large, but it was organized. Latrines were scrubbed, buckets placed neatly. A nurse who had served in the Philippines blinked at the sight of a row of wash basins with real soap beside each one. She picked it up, sniffed, and nearly dropped it. The smell of lavender punched through her memory like a bullet. It reminded her of the drawer in her mother's home, the one with letters and hair ribbons. She placed the soap back slowly, hands shaking. One guard, young, with sandy hair and a drawl thick as syrup, walked past a group of women as they returned from orientation. He touched the brim of his hat, a lazy, practiced motion. It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't even friendliness. It was respect. But coming from an American, it landed like an earthquake. One woman blushed and looked away. Another muttered, "They're playing with us." But her voice lacked conviction. This civility, this strange absence of hate, was harder to bear than cruelty. They had prepared themselves for hunger, for screaming, for punishment. They had been told the Americans were savages, that capture meant shame so deep it would blacken their names for generations. But there was no violence here, no mockery, no attempts to make them crawl. And yet every time a cup was filled, a door opened, or a name was remembered, a new unease settled in their bones. Because if this was not cruelty, what was it? What did it mean to be treated with dignity by those who owed you nothing? What did it mean to be seen, not as soldiers, not even as women, but as people? By nightfall, the silence in the barracks was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of unraveling, of realization, of staring into the dark and wondering what other lies had been told, because dignity, once given, cannot be undone. And the cowboys, their strange quiet, their small mercies, their unspoken code, they weren't just keeping the peace. They were undoing something far older, something planted in these women since before they ever wore a uniform. That night, the bunkhouse was alive with whispers, low, urgent, restless voices passing through the dark like smoke curling beneath a door. No one spoke above a hush. There was still something sacred about silence, something that felt safer when you didn't put disbelief into full sentences. The women lay in narrow cots, staring at wooden ceilings or curling against their blankets, as the rumors passed from one bunk to the next, not about escape, not about revolt, but about strange things, kind things, inexplicable things. One said she saw a cowboy crouched outside the mess tent that morning, feeding a bird with a broken wing. Said he cupped it in one hand, his thumb stroking its feathers while he whistled softly, like a lullaby. Another swore the same man had left the bird a bit of bread wrapped in cloth. "Why?" someone whispered. No one answered, because the question didn't make sense anymore. Letters were another mystery. A quiet announcement had gone around the camp. The prisoners would be allowed to write home once a week. Stationery would be provided. Some women had laughed bitterly, letters as if that mattered now, but others clutched the news like it was food. They waited anxiously for the guard with the clipboard, pressing their names onto the list with shaking fingers. In the corner bunk, one woman spent 20 minutes just staring at the blank sheet. Then she wrote 3 sentences. "I am alive. I am warm. They are not what we were told." And then she cried. Not because she feared what would happen to her letter, but because she finally had the words. Even the guards had become rumors. One was said to play harmonica at night near the perimeter fence, always the same tune, a slow, aching lullaby that drifted across the sand. Another had been seen tipping his hat to a woman as she walked to the infirmary, not with flirtation, but with something closer to respect. It wasn't these gestures that unsettled the women. It was the fact that they weren't followed by anything else. No catch, no cruelty. No cruelty was supposed to be part of the deal. And then came the laugh. It happened in the yard, near the water trough, On a hot afternoon, when the dust clung to every inch of fabric and even the air seemed too tired to move. A goat had gotten loose from somewhere. God knows how there were goats in a prisoner of war camp, and as it wandered lazily across the packed dirt, one of the guards stepped backward and tripped over it. He didn't fall gracefully. He fell like a tree, arms windmilling, his hat flying off, landing flat on his back, with a grunt that echoed across the open space. The silence was instant. No one breathed, and then, from the left row of bunks, an unmistakable sound. Laughter, quick, sharp, and completely involuntary. A prisoner had laughed. The woman's hand shot to her mouth, horrified at herself. But the damage was done. The guard sat up, looked around, spotted the goat, and then he laughed too. A quiet chuckle, more at himself than anything else. He retrieved his hat, dusted it off, and waved a lazy hand like it was no big deal. Something shifted in that moment. Not much, just a crack. But it was there. After that, the whispers changed. They weren't just about what the Americans were doing. They were about what it meant. One woman, older, who had once taught in a Tokyo girls' school, spoke softly into the dark. If the enemy has mercy, then what were we fighting? No one replied. The question was too dangerous. Some clung harder to the past. They wrote home with stiff fingers, describing barbed wire and armed guards, omitting the part about blankets and stew. They kept their backs straight, their eyes lowered, reminding themselves that this was the enemy. That comfort was a trick. But others, quietly, without saying so, began to bend. They started sitting differently at meals. They let themselves enjoy the coffee. They asked for seconds. They began to see the guards not as cowboys or captors, but as something far worse, men. Men with faces, voices, habits. Men who might not hate them. And that, in the end, was the hardest thing to fight. Because cruelty would have been easier. It would have fit the story they were told. But mercy? That left no place to hide. Aki had decided early on that she would not bend. Not for warmth, not for food, not even for the strange, quiet kindness of the men in denim. She ate only what was necessary, drank only water, and spoke to no one unless forced. Where others were beginning to shift, softening under the weight of contradiction, Aki clung tighter to the only thing she had left, refusal. Her boots were the first thing anyone noticed about her. Worn down to the heel, the leather cracked like dry earth, the soles peeling away with every step. She had tied them with bits of twine scavenged from potato sacks, looping the string through the eyelets like thread in a wound. She walked stiffly, each movement deliberate. To the others, it was madness. The Americans had offered new shoes, serviceable, plain, without markings, and yet she refused. "I don't take gifts from ghosts," she had whispered once to the woman in the bunk beside her. But even ghosts, it seemed, could be patient. Days passed, then weeks. Aki remained unchanged, as if her very silence could shield her from the strange warmth of the camp. She kept to herself during meals, always the last to enter, always the first to leave. She washed her clothes in private, hands red from the soap. Her posture was military, her stare dead ahead. But those who shared her barracks began to notice something else. She limped now, slightly, a favoring of her right foot. When asked, she said nothing. She didn't have to. Everyone knew. It happened one morning, early, while the sky was still pale with the promise of heat. Aki awoke before the bell, as she always did, and sat up slowly. The desert air pressed against the screens, already warm. She reached down for her boots and stopped. There, placed neatly at the foot of her bed, were new ones, not regulation, not military issue, Brown leather, soft at the ankle, hand-stitched soles, clean, oiled, her size. She stared at them for a long time. At first, she didn't move. Then she looked around. Everyone else was still asleep. No note, no name, just the boots, like an offering laid at an altar. She didn't speak, she didn't touch them, not yet. But something inside her cracked, just a little. Later, after the morning roll call, she vanished for almost an hour. No one noticed until the bell rang for breakfast, and her place at the table sat empty. When she returned, her hair was damp, her sleeves rolled up. Her eyes were red. Someone found her in the latrine afterward, alone in the farthest stall, sitting on the closed seat with her head in her hands. She hadn't cried when the bombs fell, hadn't cried when her unit disbanded, hadn't even cried when they were marched across enemy lines. But now she wept into her palms, and the sound was small, fragile, not grief, not fear, recognition, because the boots, those boots, reminded her of her father, of the way he used to clean her shoes before school, setting them by the door with fresh laces. He never said why. He never asked if she noticed. He simply did it, as fathers do, without ceremony. That memory, buried under layers of war and shame, came rushing back. She wore the boots the next day. She didn't speak about it. No one asked. But when a cowboy passed her in the yard and tipped his hat, she didn't look away. Not this time. She gave the faintest nod. Barely there. A ghost of a gesture. But for Aki it was a beginning, and in a place where everything had been stripped away, even a beginning was a kind of rebellion. The days took on a rhythm that none of the women had expected. They swept the barracks in the morning, helped peel potatoes in the kitchen, folded laundry, tended to small vegetable plots behind the mess hall. Tasks were assigned, not barked. There were no punishments for slowness, only polite reminders. Some of the women, at first, did their chores like prisoners, backs stiff, eyes wary. But as time wore on, the rhythm of work softened into something more familiar. Not freedom, not exactly, but something adjacent, a kind of stability that came from knowing what came next. For Aki, sweeping the mess hall floor became a ritual. The swish of the broom, the smell of old coffee grounds, the silence. It reminded her of mornings back home, long before the war, when she cleaned her father's shop before school. The rhythm kept her anchored. Others found similar solace. Folding laundry became a quiet meditation. Scrubbing pots turned into a game of who could make the metal shine the brightest. The labor didn't erase what they'd seen or lost, but it gave their hands something to do, and that alone felt like medicine. Then came the horses. It started with one of the guards, an older man with a sun-leathered face and a voice like gravel, who noticed a few of the women staring through the fence at the corral. One afternoon, without warning, he opened the gate, pointed to the saddles, and gestured. No words, just an invitation, and against all instinct they stepped through. Supervised, yes, but not leered at, not mocked. He showed them how to hold the reins, how to stand beside the animal without fear. When one woman trembled near a mare, he gently placed a sugar cube in her hand and guided it to the horse's mouth. The warmth of the tongue against her palm made her gasp. From then on, they were allowed, occasionally, to help groom the horses, never alone, but never under duress. The animals didn't care about uniforms or sides. They responded to calm, to patience, and in them some of the women found a strange kind of peace. One even began humming again, a tune from childhood, as she brushed a stallion's flank under the fading orange sky. Nature began to work its quiet miracle. The sunsets were impossible. They poured across the sky in great sheets of color, rose, gold, deep violet. The wind carried scents of mesquite and distant rain. At night, the stars blanketed the sky with such clarity that one woman wept just staring at them. There were no bombers here, no fire, just space, just quiet. And in that vast stillness, something dangerous crept in. Guilt, because alongside the peace came letters. They arrived weekly now, brought in stacks wrapped in twine. Some were damp with tears by the time they were opened. Others came in crumpled envelopes, the paper thinned by anxious hands. The words inside were sparse, censored, coded, but heavy. Descriptions of bombed cities, of hunger, of mothers digging through rubble, of sisters gone silent. And here they were, in clean clothes, with boots that fit, bellies full, brushing horses beneath open skies. The contrast was unbearable. Aki received a letter from her younger brother. It was barely 4 lines, each one trembling with worry. Tokyo is ash. Father is alive. Where are you? I dream of rain. She read it once. Then again. Then she folded it neatly and placed it under her pillow. That night she didn't eat. Not out of defiance, but shame. She looked at the bread on her plate and couldn't bring herself to touch it. They had followed orders, given everything for an empire that promised them honor through sacrifice. But now, in captivity, they were safe. Too safe. And safety without victory felt like betrayal. Barbed wire surrounded the camp, but the sky above it was endless. It asked nothing. It judged nothing. And that, too, was hard to bear. Because if the world could be this quiet, this beautiful, then what had all that pain been for? The lessons began without announcement, the way most things did in the camp. One evening, just after supper, when the heat had finally loosened its grip and the sky faded into bruised shades of blue, a guard lingered near the mess hall instead of walking back toward the perimeter. He was tall, narrow at the waist, his hat pushed back just enough to reveal tired eyes. He carried a small chalkboard under one arm and a piece of chalk between his fingers. He didn't call out. He didn't order anyone to sit. He simply wrote a word on the board and waited. Hello. A few women slowed their steps. Others pretended not to notice. Yumi stood at the edge of the light, unsure why her feet wouldn't move. She had been a radio clerk before the war, trained to repeat coded phrases without understanding them. Language, to her, had always been something dangerous, something that could betray you if mishandled. The guard glanced up, nodded once, and said the word aloud, slowly, clearly. Hello. Yumi echoed it before she realized she was speaking. The sound felt strange, round and soft in her mouth. The guard smiled, not wide, not pleased, but encouraging, as if she had done something brave without knowing it. Over the next nights, more women gathered. They sat on crates, on the dirt, on the steps of the barracks. The lessons were simple. Names, objects, gestures. The guard pointed to the sky. Sky, to the ground, earth, to himself, me, and then gently to them. You. At first the words built walls, mispronunciations, awkward pauses, embarrassed laughter swallowed quickly, as if laughter itself might be punished. But slowly the walls thinned. The women learned how to ask for water, how to say thank you, how to say I don't understand. That phrase mattered most. Language became a bridge, but also a mirror. Each new word reflected something back at Yumi she hadn't seen before. That her voice still existed, that it could move across the air and land somewhere safe. One evening, the guard asked her to read aloud. Her hands shook as she traced the letters on the board. She stumbled halfway through the sentence, her accent thickening under the pressure. Her fingers trembled visibly now, betraying her calm face. The guard watched for a moment, then spoke, low and even. Don't let them see you shaking. The words landed like a blow. Yumi froze. Her first instinct was fear, a warning, a threat. Her pulse spiked, and she looked around, suddenly aware of the others watching. The guard met her eyes. Not hard, not cruel, steady. He tapped the board lightly with the chalk. "Try again," he said. She did, slower this time. Her hands still trembled, but her voice held. When she finished, there was no applause, just a nod. Approval without spectacle. Later that night, lying on her bunk, the phrase echoed in her mind, "Don't let them see you shaking." It replayed over and over, shedding its sharpness, revealing something softer beneath. He hadn't been warning her about punishment. He'd been teaching her something else entirely. Survival. The next evening she asked what it meant. He hesitated, searching for words. Then he shrugged slightly and said, "Means you can be scared. Just don't let fear decide for you." It wasn't perfect English, but it was enough. From then on, Yumi listened differently. She noticed how the guard spoke, careful, restrained, never wasting words. She noticed how the other cowboys carried themselves the same way. Quiet strength, no boasting, no shouting. Their power wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Strength, she realized, could be quiet. Language stopped feeling like an enemy. It became a tool, a way to understand the world she was standing in now instead of the one she'd lost. She began helping others with pronunciation, repeating the guard's gestures, his patience. She practiced sentences under her breath while sweeping, while folding laundry, while staring up at the stars. And each time her hands shook, she remembered the words, not as a command, but as a kindness passed from one survivor to another. The war had taught her how to endure pain. The cowboy had taught her how to endure herself, and that lesson, spoken in a borrowed language beneath an open sky, stayed with her longer than any order she had ever received. It began with a scent, meat and onions simmering slow over a fire. Then the sound of laughter, unfamiliar but not unwelcome, drifting across the dusty yard. The sun had just dropped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the camp, and the sky was still streaked with coral light when word spread. The guards were hosting a gathering, not mandatory, not official, just something different. A handful of prisoners approached the mess tent cautiously. There, just beyond the outer wall, lanterns flickered against the dusk, swaying gently in the warm breeze. A long table had been laid out with bread, thick stew, and even a bucket of ice, precious in the desert. A battered harmonica crooned out a tune, slow and strange, its notes rising like smoke under the stars. Nearby, a crude horseshoe pit had been dug, and one guard was already lining up a throw, smiling sheepishly as it clanged off target. The women didn't quite know how to respond. It was surreal. The wire fences still stood. The guards still carried rifles slung low at their hips. And yet, here was stew. Here was music. Here was a world no one had written into the manual of war. Some accepted bowls of food with trembling hands. Others held back, their eyes darting between the guards and the gates, waiting for the catch. But the only thing that came was more stew and another harmonica tune. A little faster this time, almost playful. Then someone laughed. No one could say who it was first. It might have been the girl who'd tripped over a chair while trying to sit, or the older woman who misheard horseshoe as horse soup and made a face of pure horror. But once it started, it spread. A strange, choked laughter, born of disbelief and hunger and exhaustion and something dangerously close to joy. For a few minutes, it was as if the war had been put on pause. Laughter in a prisoner of war camp wasn't in the rules. But there it was, awkward, real, unstoppable. Yumi laughed too. She sat near the fire, spoon in hand, and watched as a guard pretended to limp after being bested by a prisoner in horseshoes. She felt the warmth of the stew in her chest and the music in her bones. It was absurd. It was real. And for once it didn't feel like betrayal. But not everyone was laughing. Aki sat apart, arms folded tightly, her eyes locked on the stars. The stew sat untouched beside her. The harmonica's melody only deepened the crease between her brows. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She watched as the women who had once sworn to die with honor now reached for second helpings and smiled at their captors. For Aki, joy still tasted like weakness. It wasn't that she wanted cruelty. It was that kindness, in its quiet way, demanded something far more difficult: forgiveness. And forgiveness, for her, would mean letting go of the face of her brother as she last saw him, the scent of burning paper in the schoolhouse, the silence of her unit, scattered like leaves after a storm. She could not laugh. Not yet. And yet, as she looked around, at Yumi smiling, at a guard balancing a cup on his head to make the younger ones giggle, she felt something flicker. Not surrender, not peace, but the terrifying recognition that maybe, just maybe, the pain did not have to last forever. The harmonica played one final tune that night, slow, haunting, gentle as breath. Some women returned to their bunks with full bellies and light hearts. Others, like Aki, walked alone beneath the stars, trying to reconcile the noise of laughter with the silence they still carried inside. Helps keep these forgotten stories alive. The announcement came during roll call, almost as an afterthought. The officer in charge, clipboard in hand, relayed it without ceremony. The women would be allowed to write home. One letter, no more than 2 pages. It would be reviewed before sending. But for the first time in months, perhaps years, they could reach across the ocean and put their own names to paper. At first, no one moved. The idea of a letter, something as intimate and delicate as handwriting, felt more dangerous than the barbed wire that hemmed them in. What could they say? What should they say? Could a single sheet of paper hold the contradiction of their daily lives? Of waking up behind fences only to be handed warm bread by a man who said, "Good morning," in broken Japanese? Some refused outright. They didn't trust the paper, didn't trust the guards, didn't trust themselves. But others began to write. Yumi was among the first. She borrowed a pencil from one of the guards and sat under the edge of the mess tent, the corner of the table scratched with initials. The first few lines came easy: name, date. She described the desert, how the air smelled after rain, how the wind pressed through the gaps in the walls at night. Then she paused. She was going to write about the camp, about how her boots fit now, about the stew, about the harmonica, about the cowboy who taught her English, and the phrase that still echoed in her mind, "Don't let them see you shaking." But when she put pencil to paper, the words stalled. How do you describe dignity when you didn't expect it? How do you admit that kindness from the enemy feels like betrayal of everything you were taught? So she did the only thing she could. She told the truth. Not the whole truth, not yet, but enough. She wrote about the guards, how they did not shout, how they looked her in the eye, how they let the women ride horses and taught them words in another tongue, how, for reasons she still didn't understand, they treated the prisoners like people. Other letters followed. Aki wrote, though hers was more formal. She didn't mention the fair, or the stew, but she did describe the boots, not the gift, only the way they no longer cut her feet. She wrote that her health had returned, that the nights were quiet, that she had not been dishonored. Others spoke of the open sky, of music, of silence without fear. None of them wrote about loyalty. None of them wrote about hatred, because by then those words had started to lose their edges. What they wrote was something far more dangerous. The enemy fed me. The enemy taught me to speak. The enemy did not break me. They made me feel human again. When those letters arrived in Japan, heavily redacted, filtered through layers of censors, something unexpected happened: panic. Because the message that slipped through wasn't about strategy or conditions, it was about compassion. And compassion, in the middle of a war built on dehumanization, was treason. A few letters were intercepted entirely. Some women never received replies. But those words, once written, couldn't be unwritten. They rippled silently through families, through post offices, through command centers. They carried the scent of stew and the sound of harmonicas and the feel of dry boots on cool desert earth. And somewhere, across that wide ocean, a father read that his daughter was alive and treated well, and he didn't know whether to feel relief or despair. Because if the enemy could be kind, what did that mean about the war? The letters were never meant to be acts of rebellion, but in their honesty, they became one. They whispered a truth no uniform could silence, that even here, behind fences, people had found the strength to speak not just of survival, but of grace. If you're enjoying this story, take a moment to like this video and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Your support helps keep these forgotten stories alive. The trucks arrived before dawn, their engines rumbling softly beneath a sky still heavy with stars. Dust curled up around the tires, catching in the folds of uniforms and skirts, and the hush that fell over the camp was not fear, but something more fragile. Uncertainty, maybe even grief. Repatriation had been spoken of in quiet tones for weeks now. Half-believed rumors passed between bunks, like secret prayers. But now it was real. Now it had shape: metal, wheels, canvas flaps, and American soldiers with clipboards. The women gathered in silence, called out by name, each standing beside a small pile of belongings that barely spoke to the lives they had lived or the ones they were returning to. There were threadbare clothes, canteens, tin mirrors, cracked combs, a handful of worn photographs. For some, there were unexpected gifts: gloves that fit too well, a folded handkerchief embroidered with initials not their own, a tin of hard candy, unopened. For Yumi, it was a blanket, the same blanket she had been given one cold night months ago when fever made her shiver uncontrollably. No one had spoken then, only the soft thud of the wool placed gently in her arms, the scent of cedar, dust, and something faintly sweet. She had not known what to make of it then, and she still didn't now. But she folded it tightly, held it to her chest, and climbed into the back of the truck. No one cried. There were no dramatic goodbyes. A few nodded, a few bowed. Some looked away. The guards stood at a distance, their hats low, rifles slung but idle. One man raised a hand in silent farewell. Then the convoy moved forward, gravel cracking under rubber, and the camp shrank behind them, fading into the desert like a story no one would believe. The journey home took days. Train cars, holding rooms, a ship that rocked too gently to trust. At each stop, the women lost something more: an item confiscated, a fellow traveler reassigned. But the real loss waited at the end. When they finally returned to Japan, the air hit them like an open wound. The scent of ash, sewage, salt, and broken brick. The cities they remembered were now ghost towns. Streets that once bustled with life were now silent, flattened, burned hollow. Yumi stepped off the transport and felt the blanket shift in her arms. It was still warm from her body. Her father stood at the gate, thinner than memory allowed, but alive. He embraced her without words, but when he pulled back and saw the blanket, his expression changed. Not anger, not relief, just a confusion too deep for words. For days she avoided telling him where it came from, not because she was ashamed, but because she didn't know how to explain that it had come from a man in a hat who had once taught her how to say the word hope. Aki returned too, though to what she never said. Her street was rubble, her mother gone, her brother's name unspoken. She still wore the boots she had once tied with string, now cracked, worn, but whole. And, like Yumi, she had nothing to offer in return except silence. No one asked about the camp. No one wanted to hear what it had been like to be treated with decency by the enemy. Some burned the gifts. One woman buried her gloves at the edge of the village. Another threw her harmonica into the sea. But most kept the items, quietly, secretly, not because they treasured them, but because they meant something no one could say aloud. They had been treated like people. And that was the burden now. Not what had been done to them, but what hadn't. They had survived, been fed, given names instead of numbers. And in that survival was the quiet, haunting knowledge that sometimes dignity had come not from loyalty, but from defeat. They had expected scars, but they carried something stranger home. Softness, a wool blanket, a memory of music, a moment when someone looked at them and did not see the enemy. These things weighed heavier than hunger, heavier than war, and they would carry them, always, in silence. The platform was quiet except for the distant hum of a vending machine and the occasional screech of a train braking somewhere far off. The air was thick with spring, warm and fragrant, and Yumi stood beneath the awning, watching her son adjust his tie with trembling fingers. He was tall now, taller than she remembered him being just last week, with his father's narrow shoulders and her eyes. He wore his nervousness plainly, a slight twitch in his jaw, a fidgeting of hands. She smiled softly, and for a moment she saw herself again. Only younger, thinner, sunburnt, and squinting across the dust of a Texas desert, trembling in a language she didn't yet understand. She stepped closer and reached out to fix the collar of his shirt. He didn't speak, and neither did she, not at first. Then, as the train pulled into view, she leaned in and whispered the words that had been given to her once, like a gift she had never known she would need again. "Don't let them see you shaking." He looked at her, confused for a moment, then nodded slowly, drawing in a breath like someone preparing to walk across a rope bridge. He turned and boarded the train, vanishing into the crowd of suits and leather satchels. She stood there for a while, the words echoing in her own chest, brushing her fingers gently over the fabric of her coat. She no longer had the blanket, not physically at least. Somewhere along the line, in a move or a moment of practicality, it had disappeared. But she remembered it with absolute clarity, the way it smelled, the way it was given, and the man who handed it to her without a word, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to treat a prisoner like a person. She didn't know his name, didn't know if he was still alive, whether he had children of his own, but his voice still lived in her, not as sound, but as shape, as meaning, as inheritance. The war had long ended. History books had done what they always do, compressing years into pages, pain into paragraphs. But some things escaped the margins, like the feeling of being seen, not interrogated, not punished, just seen, and loved, however briefly, through a gesture too small for records. She often wondered how many others had been touched like that, in moments that would never be documented or honored. How many silent mercies had been exchanged in places the world forgot, and how different things might have been, might still be, If that kind of dignity could ripple forward through time like language, passed from mother to child without ceremony. She never told her son about the camp, not in detail. She let the official versions sit in the textbooks and the obituaries, but what she did give him was the quiet inheritance of compassion. A phrase tucked into the folds of his memory, a reminder that strength does not always shout, that dignity can ride in on horseback and say nothing at all. Sometimes closure doesn't come in answers, it comes in gestures, offered blankets, worn boots, broken harmonicas beneath desert stars. It comes in sentences whispered at train stations by women who once carried barbed wire in their sleep. It comes in the understanding that to survive is not just to endure, but to recognize grace when it shows up in strange clothes and calls itself your enemy. She turned from the platform, the hum of the train fading behind her, and walked into the day with steady hands. If this story moved you, please like this video and share where in the world you're watching from. These stories live on because of you.